Welcome to Who Shaves the Barber, a philosophy podcast where we explore paradoxes, thought experiments, and other pointless problems. I'm your host, William Nava. Before starting today's interview, I want to give a quick preface since it's been a while since I've released one of these. So obviously this is no longer a weekly podcast. I wrote a post announcing this when it first happened, but thought it'd be good to mention it here as well. I first took an extended break from interviewing to focus on a major project that I was working on. So that's now done, so I do have some more time now to do these interviews, and I'm really looking forward to doing so. But even so, I won't be returning to a regular schedule anytime soon, and part of the reason for that is that I want to focus more of my free time on writing informal but extended and pretty thought out, and therefore time-consuming, blog posts and articles on philosophical issues. You can find those at williamnava.com/blog. Just a word about today's interview. This is the first time I've interviewed two people at once. The topic is anarchism, which is one that I've discussed here a few times, at least nominally. However, I say nominally because every time I've done an episode on anarchism before, it's been on really idiosyncratic or kind of unique aspects of anarchism. So first, there was my interview with Thomas Kay, which was an interview that I really enjoyed, but it was with an anarchist who was a thoroughly propertarian/libertarian anarchist, which means he was really in a fairly isolated and kind of unique tradition within anarchism. So isolated, in fact, that many, I would say even most other anarchists don't consider that tradition to even be a part of anarchism. I'm not sure that I agree with that, but there's no question that it is a very sort of separate tradition within anarchism. And then after that interview, I also did two solo episodes running through my own just thoughts on anarchism. And again, while I enjoyed doing those, and it was valuable for me just to work through my own thoughts on that, those were on my kind of idiosyncratic questions and approaches to anarchism and to political philosophy in general, and not so much about the anarchist tradition as such. Today's interview, on the other hand, is with two people that, in my estimation, are anarchists that fall squarely in the actual anarchist tradition, right? These are people whose thinking falls within the sort of anarchist canon as I think it's more generally understood. One more thing I'd like to say is that in recent months, I've had something of an identity crisis about whether I'm even an anarchist anymore. In many ways, I suspect I'm not. And this interview was extremely helpful for me to clarify some of the questions that I've been having about that issue of whether I'm even an anarchist anymore, and therefore also, what is anarchism? I'm actually working on a blog post now, another one of these fairly extended posts, in which I run through a lot of the issues that are raised in this interview and explained where I stand on them and why. Beyond that, I will say I think this interview also can serve as a fairly decent introduction to anarchism for people who aren't familiar with anarchist thought at all. In any case, I've ranted enough. Here's my interview with anarchists William Gillis and Ryan Neuschbauer. Okay, so let's get started. So I have with me today William Gillis and Ryan Neuschbauer, and we're here to have a conversation about anarchism. As we were just discussing a moment ago, since there's two Williams here, we're going to try to, at least the Williams will be referred to by last name so that there isn't confusion. Rather than introduce you, I know a bit about both of you in different ways. I actually would prefer to just ask you guys to just say, who you are and your kind of connection to anarchism. Ryan, let me go with you first.
So I don't know if you want me to talk about where I grew up, but I generally grew up in the Houston area, lived in Colorado for probably about 5.5 years, and then just returned to the Houston area. Career focus is clinical counseling. That's kind of the direction I'm headed in. I got to anarchism over probably the course of 8 or so years of mixing with sort of the right libertarian tradition and then moving over to more left market anarchism and just broader libertarian socialist spaces. And so probably the last 4 years, I've been more than not in the left market anarchist C4SS spaces. So I don't know if that gets what you're looking for, but okay, cool.
And Gillis, how about you?
I have a storied and long history with anarchism. My father was an anarchist. I grew up in an activist far left household, and I've been organizing. I've been reading anarchist theory since I was very young, and I've been organizing since the Battle of Seattle in '99 in various capacities. And at some point, not some point, around 2003, I got bitten by the critique or the information and calculation problems with regards to economic planning, and got more and more invested inside of market analysis and economics, and how you can have or how you can make market economics reconcilable with anarchist ethics. So that's kind of my background.
Interesting. So unlike Ryan, and actually I'll say myself as well, you come from a more left social anarchism place and sort of moved into the market anarchism side of things later?
Yeah, so, I mean, going real far back, my father kind of got introduced to anarchism in the Korean War, but then he organized, alongside Cesar Chavez, Catholic worker anarchist tradition, organizing unions and worker struggles. He was involved in the burning of the Bank of America in 1970 in Isla Vista, in those riots and fighting with the police. He has a long history of that stuff. Or he's dead now, but he did. My mother comes from more of like a state socialist background. She cried when the Berlin Wall fell because she thought that it was a terrible disaster. So I definitely have strong roots on the left, and I was converted, intellectually through reading a number of things and engaging with people, specifically on the issue of coordination and calculation problems.
So, as one more bit of context before we get into the actual sort of theory of anarchism and that stuff, Gillis, could you say a bit about C4SS? Because I think of, it always gets a little muddy when you have different ideological labels that all have different associations. But basically, when I think of left market anarchism, I think of essentially a hub that roughly surrounds C4SS. So I think it's kind of relevant to this discussion. Could you say a bit about what C4SS is?
Sure. So I'm the coordinating director at the Center for a Stateless Society, and I have been for 3 years now. We are a publishing house, kind of a media center, and our goal is to provide a place for more advanced discourse, as well as up-to-date commentary, and some more academic content that would not go through normal academic channels. So we publish studies on specific questions in political economy. We host people from across the anarchist spectrum in symposiums, and we publish a number of essays. We publish exchanges between people, and we've published books. And I think it's kind of unfortunate that we've become the synonymous clearinghouse with the broader left market anarchist milieu or milieus. I would prefer if there wasn't just one of us, and if people didn't just lean on us the entirety to represent everything. But we have kind of become this center of a broad movement or cultural milieu. And our politics are very diverse. There's a lot of different people involved in the center that have politics of philosophies of different types, coming from different backgrounds. But I'd say that the thing that most defines us is, or the place that I would peg us in terms of movement history, is we're kind of the direct continuation of the Journal Liberty, or the sort of politics of the Journal Liberty, which was run by Benjamin Tucker in Boston from the 1880s, 1890s, and 1910s, or 1900s, 1900s, that helped shape American individualist anarchism and influenced quite strongly both the mainstream anarchist movement and the lighter libertarian movement that emerged, or right libertarianism, as some would know it.
Great, yeah. And if I could just put in my own personal little plug, not only am I mentioning C4SS for context, but it's just one of my, as far as looking for work on kind of sort of academic work on anarchist theory, that's my top place to go. So anybody that's interested in what we're talking about, I would say probably first place to go is C4SS. Okay, so let me start then, and sorry for being the kind of, the typical philosopher here by starting with this question, but I want to ask each of you, I want to ask each of you in turn to answer the question, for you, what is anarchism? And let me start with you, Ryan.
For me, anarchism is the position that authority is unjust. In as far as the actual word itself comes from Greek, it's the negation of archy, right? So a negation of ruling power, essentially. So that would include state systems as we're used to today, whether it's U.S. government or something small, as well as other types of hierarchical enterprises, specifically the type of capitalist firms we see today. I have some nuances there, as I'm sure you do as well. But I'd say for me, that's generally the position.
And by the way, before I continue, let me just say, at any point, both of you should feel free to jump in. So I'm kind of starting in saying like, hey, Ryan, what do you think? And Gillis, what do you think? But, feel free to sort of just interrupt at any point and if you have something to say. So yeah, what about you, Gillis?
I mean, roughly along the same lines, anarchism is rejection of domination, of hierarchy or social hierarchy, as much as possible. I would say that it's the expansion of freedom, and further, anarchism not only tries to counter and demolish or diminish power relations, relations of domination and constraint, but it also, I think, is founded on the notion that your freedom is my freedom, and that the world is not a negative sum game or a zero sum game. It's a positive sum game, and that struggles to expand the the liberation or the possibilities, the options of others, does not in any way innately constrain you. And so I would say the notion of solidarity and liberty is very central to anarchism and differentiates it from, say, more of a Nietzschean or a variety of other sort of takes that see freedoms, individual freedoms, as in competition or in conflict with one another innately.
So both of you, so Gillis, you had a kind of positive component there in the sense of talking about the positive value of freedom and of solidarity, but you've also talked about, both of you have mentioned an opposition to power, authority, domination, hierarchy. And I think people usually, when they think of anarchism, they tend to usually first think of that kind of negative component, is that it's an opposition to something. And I kind of want to explore that aspect of it first. And all of those terms have slightly different nuances, right? Domination, hierarchy, power, etc. I kind of want to start with hierarchy. First of all, it's probably the definition I've most generally heard of anarchism, that it's an opposition to unjust hierarchy. And I think for a lot of people, one thing that comes to mind is that there are forms of hierarchy that are not necessarily unjust, that there could be relationships between people in which there is some dimension along which there is a level of hierarchy, and yet that not imply necessarily a power differential or a relationship of domination. So for either of you, where do you see the line between the kind of, the fact that there's many different kinds of potential relationships which may have a potentially hierarchical structure? Where's the line between a sort of possibly benign version of that to where it's domination, or are all forms of hierarchy domination? Like, where do you stand on that?
So I think that the term hierarchy can be kind of unfortunate in its broad use, and so while I used it in that broad definition or that sequence of definitions, I generally avoid using that, except in maybe very common vernacular. In part, not because I think many anarchists go too far in analyzing hierarchies. I think we don't go far enough in critiquing social hierarchies. But I've seen hierarchy used in sloppy language and imprecise philosophical frameworks. And I've seen people take a fetishization of that language to absurd places. One standard example is the preferring one thing over another thing is hierarchy, and thus we must, that is a bad thing instead of
Jordan Peterson.
Right. Well, so I mean, like, having a long history in the expansive, millions of people strong anarchist movement around the world that is perhaps broadly would be characterized from a right libertarian perspective as social anarchist, although that term has its own, baggage and context and history. But you might see those people as broadly more left-wing than those who come from a right libertarian background. It's not uncommon to find people who take a critique of hierarchy in what I feel is unproductive philosophical directions. And one common example that I just quoted is, the preferring some things over other things is hierarchy. Quantifying things is hierarchy. Relationships of prioritization are hierarchy. And I don't think that those are particularly constructive insofar as we're going to have any sort of conversation or discourse or, intellectual anything. There's going to be differentiation and preferences within that. So this may seem like a really, obtusely a straw man sort of example of the breakdown, but that's one of the reasons why I try to avoid generally using the term hierarchy, although it is the most common frame that people use or the most common language that people use to describe what anarchism opposes. My orientation is more to say that anarchism is about expanding freedom, and so and deeply attached to that is the notion that, like, holding other individuals back or constraining their options is forbidden or negative as a consequence of that, entailed inside of that preoccupation or that ethical obligation. So, as a consequence of that, I think that what does it mean to hold? There's a rich array of issues that come to the fore when you're talking about constraints of people's options. And I think that's something that the social anarchist movement, or the more mainstream, the actual, contiguous, millions of people strong anarchist movement, the one that has the rich and broader history than more right libertarian branches from it, I think that they correctly and insightfully investigate a vast panoply of interesting examples of interpersonal dynamics. We might call them power dynamics here, of relationships of constraint is perhaps how I would frame it more concretely. So I see that anarchism extends far beyond, like, an opposition to the state, an opposition of formal positions of claimed authority, and extends into interpersonal dynamics, psychological dynamics, a rich array of cultural issues, things beyond that. And that our opposition to the state is, if anything, maybe 1% of everything that anarchism stands for.
Is there anything you wanted to add to that, Ryan?
So, yeah, I could see it going a lot of directions. I often think of anarchism, just personally anyways, as sort of an evolving project. Too often in these discussions, especially with maybe more libertarian communist types, it's sort of conceptualized as we move from this society that has all these various hierarchies to overnight everything's been flattened in every direction by 100%. And I mean, that's the way we try to conceptualize where we move to, depending on what tendency we have. And I oftentimes hear it in that way. And I think just practically anyways, it's unlikely you're going to flatten everything right away if that's what you want. But when it comes to the hierarchy question, so for us, it's like firm organization is a question that usually comes up within C4SS circles quite a bit. If you had a totally free market, would that just produce, a primarily workers' co-op oriented economy, or would there still be some? And then if there were still some, would those be unjust? Should we still try to find some way to eliminate them, that kind of thing? I feel like very quickly we can move in that direction, and that's actually where my mind tends to go. But I have difficulty with that question because on the one hand, there are some more, we used the term earlier, social anarchists, I'll just go with libertarian communists for the moment, who will say, well, it may seem bad if we constantly try to smash or disrupt any more hierarchical firm from arising in society because there might be a threat to that being normalized again. That's generally something that I've heard, and it's not, on the face of it, unreasonable to think that. In anti-fascist discourse, even there's that kind of topic of, well, we don't want to allow this type of way of relating to one another to be normalized throughout society. So it's something that needs to be opposed pretty strongly without reservation. And so that can be applied to the hierarchical firm view. My own view kind of takes from what Gillis was saying earlier about the let's expand as many options as possible. Let 1,000 flowers bloom kind of a perspective. That's usually how I'll say it. Once you dismantle the structures in society that allow these kind of, you might say capitalist firms or very hierarchical forms of governance, even if it's a local government level, municipality. You can even think of a council commune type of situation where there's like maybe 4 people on a board and they decide stuff. Generally, we should be opposing all that stuff and breaking down those structures. As far as what might spontaneously come about, if people just decide to, in some area, voluntarily be a part of a firm that's more hierarchical, I generally don't go to the position of, well, let's go over there and, disrupt and smash them down and that kind of thing. It can obviously get more nuanced than that if they're trying to disrupt other people's societies and stuff. But my mind where I'm at does not go to that place. I'm not too concerned with if those people voluntarily do it, then that's going to be like kind of this contagious thing where then it's going to be normalized throughout society and other people will do it and we'll be right back to where we are. I'm not as prone to that kind of thinking, but I am generally skeptical across the board of those kinds of vertical arrangements. And I feel like that's maybe where Gillis is. Maybe he can jump in and clarify, but that's at least where I'm at.
So the way that I typically tend to approach this in terms of quick anecdotes is if we were to talk about a free society, it seems very likely that there would still be people who would voluntarily relate to one another, regardless of cultural changes that have happened. We could see positive or productive reasons for them to relate towards one another in ways that is not always cartoonishly flat. One example would be a few friends getting together to make a movie, and one person serves as the artistic vision for that movie, and other people act as actors within that movie. And some particularly ideologically hard-nosed communists might object and say, the movie should be the artistic vision for the movie should be entirely collective, entirely flat. One person should not be in sort of such a position of authority that they can direct or even write the script by themselves. And you could see, maybe a case for that. But even in those situations, there would still be, I think many people would concede that there would be things like extras who would not necessarily have as much artistic say in the production. And it may be perfectly reasonable to ask a few of your friends to come down to set and serve as extras in the background of an artistic vision that maybe you and your friends are putting together. Do those people get paid and the same way that you do? Do those people have exactly the same say in the movie? I think most people, including the most diehard communists, would tend to concede in this hypothetical example, that there would be a place for some level of differentiation, some level of authority in a very voluntary way. And I think that this plays out more broadly when you think of activist organizations. Oftentimes there are a few individuals who have a lot of institutional memory. Those individuals may have been involved in a struggle or a type of work for a very long period of time, and may know particulars about some things, and their voices may carry stronger than other people's. And I think that we would be wrong to ignore the authority of the bootmaker, as Bakunin once put it, which is to say the expertise, the accumulated knowledge, the wisdom, and the general, perhaps greater investment that that person has put in over time. However, all that said, I still believe that anarchism should push back against those interpersonal hierarchies. When we think about the situation of the authority of the bootmaker, when we think about the activist who's been there for ages and really knows how to settle this sort of problem and has done it 1,000 times and very quickly gives the blueprint to everyone, and other people can either ignore him or very quickly adopt it. I think that that's dangerous, and I think that as anarchists, part of our goal should be pushing back on the interpersonal and cultural level against structures, norms, habits of mind, ways of thinking, ideologies that lead to that kind of accumulation of very informal hierarchy, very informal authority or power concentrations. In the example of expertise, certainly I concede to the expertise of the doctor who, I go in for a general practitioner or checkup or something along those lines. But we can still look at the perniciousness of the inaccessibility of that expertise. So we can look more broadly in that society and see, like, how hard is it for someone to acquire the expertise of a doctor? How centralized is the certification processes by which someone can become a doctor? How much work needs to go into that? How hard is it? How well have we developed tools or social structures to impart that knowledge as quickly and efficiently as possible without, recreating new hierarchies? And so I think that accessibility in a lot of ways is a deeply anarchist question and imperative.
So I kind of want to pose a concrete example because I think we're not even talking politics yet. We're talking interpersonal relationships, but I think that's part of what's unique and valuable about anarchism is that it is a politics that is fundamentally based around an ethic of interpersonal relationships, which we then just carry out into the political sphere. So, and I think at the level of interpersonal relationships, people who and people listening might at this point, I think there's almost like you might even have like a concern, like, wait a minute, am I in hierarchical relationships? So here's the one I want to actually pose a personal one and tell me what you guys really think. I won't be offended or anything. This is something I actually really enjoy thinking about. So I have a job, I have a boss. I work with a small team at the moment. There's 7 of us, and I'll just tell you a little bit about how it works. So there's clearly there's a general manager who's the person up top, and any sort of major decision ultimately has to be approved by him to move forward. Even beyond that, I actually have a sort of supervisor, who's sort of below him and is my personal supervisor. So clearly, at the face of it, we have a very hierarchical structure. I mean, with such a small number of people, you already have like 3 levels. On the other hand, I feel totally free to basically bring up anything. I mean, I actually would feel perfectly comfortable coming up to my supervisor and saying, I'm not sure that you're the right supervisor for me. And I don't think that I would be sort of punished. I feel a very open culture of, we're a small team. Anything that can be made to make this better, like, feel free to bring it up. And no one is like too small here for ideas or suggestions. It sits fairly well with me, but on the other hand, it is obviously hierarchical. There's also a potential power dynamic there in the sense that though I feel quite comfortable bringing up all sorts of things, at the end of the day, I could get fired, and I don't want to get fired, right? And that's like a thing that's obviously always there with a job of this sort. There's also, I don't know exactly what they make, but I'm quite sure my superiors make more than I do. And, I wanted to kind of come back to something you said earlier, Gillis, about constraint. And one way of thinking about this is as like an ethic of minimizing the constraint that we put on each other. And to some extent, there's constraints involved in this job. So there's things that I have to do that aren't necessarily what I would most immediately want to do. I don't ever have to do something that I feel like I really don't want to do. I think I feel perfectly comfortable saying I really don't want to do this. But there's things that are certainly not at the top of my to-do list, and yet, because it's my job, I have to do them. And yet, part of that constraint is something that seems valuable to me, because there are levels of constraint that I think of as being really beneficial on the level of something like character building, and also just and skill building. I think that generally applies, and I generally think that there's a kind of line with constraint. Like, there's actually forms of constraint that are healthy, and in a way, like, I want to seek people out who want to sort of propose healthy constraints on me, though I would never want them to impose them on me against my will, obviously. So anyway, I just kind of gave you guys a lot, but I wanted to give you this picture of what I think is kind of a borderline case, maybe, of well, it's a clear case of hierarchy, but maybe a borderline case of power dynamics, and see how you would respond to it from the lens of your version of anarchist theory.
Well, so there's a lot of dimensions of that. I would say that, first off, when we get on the macro level, there's the issue of the perniciousness of the structures that we participate in. So if you have a hierarchical workplace, or if you have those informal or those formal hierarchies present around you, they may not be actively constraining you in present ways or things that are pertinent in your daily life, but you're kicking the can down the road. Something could arise in some different direction. Conflict with a coworker, somebody new is hired, some stressful thing arises and the business is trying to deal with, and those things could turn pernicious in a way that right now is not problematic, but will be problematic in the future. We can think of comparisons to the government. Somebody in a particularly lax Western social democrat government may say, look, you guys are talking about all these constraints or all these ways the government is bad, but nobody's kicking down my door, and I don't have the boot of a cop on my neck right now. I actually like the president. She's really nice to me. These relationships are generally positive, and the people in power, they may be a little bit bumbling, but they mean well. And, we have this conversation. This is a perfectly acceptable way to do it. It seems to work quite well. None of the horrible things that you guys talk about, the imperialism, the conquest, the oppression, etc., all those things seem to be the case for other governments and not for our government in particular. But the anarchist analysis of this is to look, I think, at a longer time preference, or to look at wider horizons, and to say, yes, these things are not particularly constraining you right now, but they have a certain inclination, or they have a certain momentum. And if you build hierarchical structures, fundamental limitations, both in terms of the ways that they process things, but also in how they deal with certain problems. But also in terms of human psychology, and in terms of just straight up game theory, when all of the power is accumulated in a centralized way, etc. Those things compound, and you can reach a situation, very rapidly or very slowly, in which it is incredibly negative, and there's nothing you can do about it then. So better to, even in those moments where, things seem to be moving very smoothly, remove the authority or the power that later could be used for great harm. I think a lot of Democrats, for example, did not see executive order overreaches by Obama, for example, as being particularly pernicious, because the things that were being accomplished with them seemed relatively mundane, or counters to great evils that they perceived had been done. However, having established that precedent, having given more power to the executive, that was then handed into the hands of fucking Donald Trump. And so I think that, a lot of times small hierarchies, small things, things instead of our everyday lives a lot of the time they're not that pernicious. They're not that actively pernicious in our everyday lives. But the dangers are still there in really deep ways. And I think those dangers can, despite them, or in fact as a consequence of them being very small, being very localized to our lives, to our everyday lives and our everyday experiences, be all the worse for it. So an example would be, you can get into a marriage with someone, and the person that you live with, the problems that you have with them can have a great impact upon your life, far more than the cop that gives you a speeding ticket or that harasses you a little bit on the street. The interpersonal relationships that we keep up over time, they can cause us immense stress, immense pain, immense suffering, and the workplace is a huge section of our lives. So a small amount of hierarchy, or a large amount of hierarchy, but that doesn't seem particularly pernicious, that seems benevolent, or the culture generally pushes back against it, can seem to be not that much of an issue right now. But anarchism warns that, this can spiral out of control, and that we should push back against any of these things, no matter how seemingly mundane or, anodyne they may appear. And then more broadly, you were talking about a culture in your workplace. And I think that that's really important too, because it's one thing to say that there's a formal power structure, but if there's an informal culture that pushes back against the abuse of power, well, that should not be something that we ignore. That's a really important component of that society. And the vast majority of the things that make up our society, the things that make up and the things that determine our experiences day to day are cultural. They're more diffuse, they're more amorphous, they're complex, they're infinitely multifaceted. The state is merely one instantiation of social relations. A corporate hierarchy or a hierarchy at your workplace is only one tiny instantiation of all the things that play in those relationships. The piece of paper that says that I'm your boss and you're not, it can oftentimes have a far less weight than the broader institutional culture of a business. And so it's very much in the wheelhouse and the subject of anarchism to talk about those cultural issues and to try to make it so that they are, the culture is more anarchistic. But just because anarchism has succeeded on some fronts, on cultural fronts, and anarchism has certainly succeeded on many cultural fronts, things that anarchists were once the sole wild-eyed pioneers of when it comes to gender, when it comes to sexuality, race relations, things along those lines, have now become incredibly mainstream in modern Western society. And so those advances are not nothing. Those advances perhaps more impact the lives of millions, if not billions, than struggles around the expanse of state taxation power or the formal authority of police. But we would be wildly naive to give it up and to say that those are the only things that matter.
And Ryan?
Yeah. So your point about right now the manager situation that you have, you said, was it 3 levels? 3 levels of management?
Right.
What's that?
Yeah.
Okay,
so,
yeah. And overall, you're feeling pretty okay, and you feel comfortable coming to whoever the manager is right now and voicing your concern about XYZ issue. And I agree with what Gillis was saying about, kind of kicking the can down the road, because, that manager might not be there next week. Even if that person is I think the equivalent would be when Democrats say, we got to get the right people in, the state. We just got to vote the right people in. But, they're almost never there. In your case, maybe it happens to be on this micro level in the business. They're there and you're pleased with them, but they can leave any time. And so say that this new manager comes in and they're a tyrant, and you're not feeling like you can come up to them and, voice your concerns, even minute concerns. And maybe you had one even brief altercation with them, and you're not on speaking terms. Like you haven't been fired, but clearly you're not looking to see them around the corner when you go to the office either. And that could be, just even from my own experience, extremely oppressive. I've been in a situation once where that was the case, and that affected how I slept. It affected how I couldn't eat. I was constantly just besides myself. Just the totality of my existence was thrown into sway because, the job is what gets you the money to pay rent. It's what gets you to be able to afford healthcare. And pretty much everything is tied to that job. Like Gillis was saying, I may not see the oppressive cop on the street in my entire week, right? Or heck, maybe even a month if I'm lucky. But I'm going to see that manager pretty frequently, almost every day in a lot of people's cases. And so that plays a very pivotal role under, say, an anarchistic analysis, because if our goal is to, maximize freedom, maximize exit potential, I think that's one of the ways I like to frame it too, exit potential. Then even this managerial arrangement that you have that might be okay now, in the long run could turn quite horrific. And so that's why I would say, even in your case, that from at least my analysis of the situation, I would probably be like, well, there's some heavy skepticism. Isn't it possible we could even have another arrangement here? So even if it's the case that right now it's doing the job, it's fine. If you've got this better arrangement that you could have, which would then be more robust, it would, avoid worrying about, God, next week is John going to quit, and then horrific Jane's going to come in, or Joseph's going to come in 2 weeks later after that person quits, and it's going to be even worse. It's looking for this long run maximization of freedom in a robust format. So that's probably what I would say there. Yeah.
So the first answer that comes to mind to me, like a sort of response to that, which I suspect will be one that will come to mind for a lot of people, particularly people who are not anarchists or in sort of radical spaces, is to say something like, "Oh, well, if you get a tyrannical manager, then at that point you quit." And for me, in this particular context that I'm in right now, I actually feel fairly good about that, in the sense that I actually think that the fact that if I did have to quit, I would feel okay doing so, in the sense that it wouldn't really, like, I would manage for a while and I'd be able to find something else. I feel fairly confident about that. Is something that makes it so that I'm not so afraid of losing the job that I would sort of put up with something like that. But I know from my own personal experience in the past, being in a different context, being in a situation where you feel like, actually, if I lose this job, I could be really screwed over. So while my first thought is like, oh, you can leave, my very next thought is that really, really depends on the person's situation, whether realistically they can leave. I mean, we can, of course, hide behind this like technical idea of consent. I'm like, well, if you're in the job, you chose it. But of course, for some people, that's really only technical, and really they can't leave because of whatever their context is. But I guess the question that makes me want to sort of follow up with is, assuming I'm right, and maybe you guys would disagree with me about that, but assuming I'm right, that in a sense, the context you're coming from in terms of how much freedom you have in your general life, and that affects whether a certain type of relationship is actually one of power or not, is that possibly pointing to us sort of being misguided in where we are in the first place, right? Like, it seems like if I'm right now in a situation where I feel like, oh, this hierarchy is not problematic to me, because if it gets to a point where I don't like it, I can leave. And before, at a different time in my life, I didn't feel that way. It seems like maybe the real issue here is not being in a hierarchical relationship or what seems like a power dynamic, but really having what you need in your life in order to be able to be the sort of person that can stand up for yourself if somebody did try to, exert some kind of domination over you.
So, I mean, we definitely agree in the broader sense that, the deprivation of easy means or security to basic essentials inside of one's life towards a number of, things is incredibly an important issue. And part of the left market anarchist perspective has historically been that, we can create a world of plenty, a world of abundance, a world that provides far more than the present society does. And through that abundance, free people from a kind of desperation where, the only way that you can make ends meet to be able to like continue to pay rent, to be able or to have a place to live or whatever the case is through accepting, work conditions that are otherwise less ideal. And then there's a variety of political economy analyses that look at like, broad structures and why have certain work forms been normalized versus other ones? Why do certain like, formulas or firm characteristics broadly permeate through the existing, capitalist society? Why do so many people work as wage laborers? Why do so many people rent as opposed to owning, that kind of thing? And while there are individual cases where people can say like, and this, at this extreme, it makes total sense on the margin or whatever for this person to choose or to live this way, and this is a net positive for them. We can also look, in aggregate and say like, there's a huge disenfranchised population that is desperate in a lot of different ways, and that disenfranchisement, that destitution of them is structurally the result of the subsidy of, violence of history, colonialism, state violence, etc. All sorts of different atrocities. And we can look at the ways that those things play forward. We can look at, things just even the tax code. We can look at things in terms of like, the regulation of businesses and how all those things perpetuate hierarchies and force people into, the very idea that there's such a thing as unemployment. That's a category where there are people who desire to have job or desire to work in a productive way for society and cannot is insane. Almost anyone can do productive work. Almost anyone in our society, and certainly those who are broadly categorized within the government statistics as unemployment statistics, all of those people have things that they can do. The question is like, why can't they do that for themselves? What are the barriers in a variety of ways in which they are forced to compete or to, subservient themselves inside of the standard wage labor relationship under bosses and hierarchical businesses and firms, etc. And a lot of that, if not literally all of it, but certainly a lot of it, is the result of broad institutional, broad cultural, broad sociological patterns and forces. Historical consequences that we should be looking at, and then we should be centering our attention on. But there's something that I wanted to go back to in a more philosophical direction that Ryan was talking about. Ryan talked about exit, and I don't think that the notion of freedom, I don't think that exit is a particularly productive way of looking at freedom. I think that it's certainly a component of freedom. But I think that when you look at how many choices you have and how many choices you could have and how are you being constrained in such what ways and what is the depth of those choices, the extent of the consequence of your action through those those branching possibilities of the choices that you do have available for yourselves. The thing, in terms of social relations, the question is not always a matter of whether or not you have exit from those things, although certainly everyone should always be able to have exit. But the question is oftentimes, how connected or how much connectivity do you have available for yourself and for your movement through this world? If you are confined to a small tribe in a small community in the middle of nowhere, you have very little in the way of options. You have very little in the way of people that you can collaborate with in whatever form. It is the internetworking of larger numbers of people that provides us with more options, more capacity to productively, in a non-zero-sum way, strive and commune together to expand not just our individual freedom, but the freedom of everyone involved in that network. So I think that oftentimes the language of exit becomes very problematic when people focus upon that in isolation and ignore the wider context of how many options does a person have. And so this goes back to specifically the issue of the very thin notion of consent of, well, you're working for this job and you could have worked for a different one. So, clearly this is as good as it can get. And you have, this is the best possible thing that could be available for you. But if the broader availability of what jobs are there on the market, what forms. I don't want to even say employment, because there's so many. We think our entire notion of the economy is so warped towards like you have a job and not you do work and get paid for it, right? We think in terms of who is my master, and not in terms of like what contract am I, we don't think as individual contractors or people, or hustlers. We think as, who is my master? Who am I enslaved to in such and such way? How do I construct my identity in relation to specific codified, institutionalized, very rigid hierarchies that I find myself embedded within? And this is also the case even when people are talking about cooperatives. I've worked at cooperatives, and cooperatives are not necessarily free from a lot of the irrationalities that pervade firms in general. Sure, there are some things interpersonally that can be a lot better about that structure. Sometimes things can turn perniciously, and it's just as a single individual boss or a hierarchy, a ladder of bosses above you can be pernicious, so can the democracy of the mob. So too can that be pernicious. Some people don't participate inside of a collective process that much because they're not particularly interested in wasting their entire time at deciding something for a cooperative. As a consequence, the people who are strongly invested in having power inside those things, their voice carries stronger, etc. There are a lot of different pernicious ways in which individuals can have their options, their connectivity, the broader possibility available to them in life curtailed by certain social forms and by certain social structures. And we should, as anarchists, always be on the lookout for those things. But at the same time, we live in this world and not the world of angels, and there will always be some level of constraint. Gravity exists. There's all kinds of limitations to our brains. There's all kinds of limitations to what is possible in our world today. Anarchism, I don't think, is a matter of, one glorious revolution happens and we are whisked into a perfect world of utopia. I think anarchism is a constant struggle. It is an arrow without perhaps a conclusion. It is a direction of expanding freedom, of expanding, collaborative possibility, and along the way that involves fighting back and resisting those that would constrain in systematic and substantive, particularly pernicious ways. But I don't think that we get to call it a day ever.
Ryan, did you want to add anything or say anything about that?
I agree. I wrote, like, the only CPRSS I ever wrote, I said something of the lines of, we should kind of reject final states of existence altogether, and instead emphasize the importance of a never-ending discovery process in producing a better world. So I guess I kind of agree there with Gillis that it's kind of better not to think about things in terms of you're in this one state and then, hopefully this revolution comes tomorrow and then we're in this perfectly, depending on how you conceptualize it, flattened world where, everybody relates to each other exactly the way, an anarchist would want. But so where you were going with that earlier, I think Gillis was also critiquing the over-focus on exit potential, which I agree with. I kind of see it as two sides of the same coin, building newer possibilities at the same time as, while those new possibilities are being built, you just, following it will have easier exit potential because you have more options to you. But I do agree that how you focus on it makes a difference, because in a very kind of rigid, you might say right libertarian, more ANCAP style, it's kind of like, well, who cares that there's all this abuse over here? Instead of focusing on opposing the abuse and opposing maybe future occurrences of the abuse, we'll just, hey, you can go elsewhere. And it, regardless if it's suboptimal or what have you, whether or not you can find a situation specifically in terms of jobs where it's either the same level of income you were getting before or more, kind of doesn't matter. It's just like, hey, you can always leave. And that can become a very dismissive and authoritarian perspective in and of itself, because then you're kind of justifying really unfree situations and abusive situations that a lot of people are stuck in. I mean, I've actually seen someone once say, "Oh, well, if a woman's getting beaten by her husband, why doesn't she just leave? There's all these men in the world or whatever. She can just go." And that's not in touch with people's experiences and the way these types of dynamics play out in practice. And that's for me when it comes to how you conceptualize freedom, and then in terms of, since we support markets, what markets should look like. It's just not as simple as saying, "Oh, well, at least I can, the manager's not going to be waiting at the exit door with a gun keeping me in." It's also about, well, okay, if all my other options are more places with managers who are going to be, worse or, still about the same, then, I'm running to what? And if the economy that I'm nested within depends on me, or at least my participation in that economy, and being able to access the basic necessities is dependent on being in those relations because they're the only game in town, then that's a problem. So how we solve that going forward is where I guess the left market anarchist critique starts kicking in. Gillis was the one, I believe, actually coined the term freed market. And
No.
I guess. Oh, did you not?
Yeah. Sorry. Yes, freed market. Sorry, I thought you were going to go further on. Sorry. Yes, I did.
No. I'm not going to go into the whole idea of free market, but I was going to say that it will be very quick that we could be jumping into talking the dynamics of that. But I just wanted to note that that's kind of important when we're talking about the existence of markets and currency in general. There's just no way you can talk about that firm organization isn't going to be in there, which has the hierarchy and all that stuff that we have been talking about. So I'm just saying, based on what Nava was saying earlier, is that it's just not enough to focus on that exit potential. So I pretty much agree with you, Gillis, about that. So yeah.
So I think I'm on the same page with both of you guys regarding the idea that exit potential is a fairly, I think you, Gillis, you said something. You said thin. I think that's right. I have, when I have tried to pin down, what's like the most useful definition or approach to freedom that we can take for practical considerations like this, I think I like to think much more in terms of availability of options than in terms of exit potential. In part because your availability of options will mostly determine what your exit potential actually is. Again, in a sort of serious and pragmatic way, as opposed to in a sort of kind of technical way of pure thin consent. So I want to ask something that takes us in a slightly different direction, but still basically where we've been so far. And that is, you both emphasized this one particular opposition to hierarchical structure as being that even if you like your leaders now, by being in a hierarchical situation, you open yourself up to the possibility that a terrible leader will come in later. And I agree with that. That makes a lot of sense to me. But the kind of objection that I want to raise is something like this: are we kind of looking for a false sense of security by wanting to move into purely horizontal structures, because horizontal social structures could end up turning bad just as easily, right? So if you are in a hierarchical structure, in the future you might get a terrible tyrant. In a horizontal structure, maybe we're all getting along now, but in the future there will be some mutual horizontal disagreement, and there'll be this sort of like kind of chaotic and disorganized discoordination from the fact that we're not getting along, which could actually have just as bad consequences, even if it doesn't involve one particular person or one particular group being in power. And I guess that is more closely what people think of when they think of anarchy as an epithet, right? Like this disorganized group of people that disagree with each other. So on a sort of basic level, why is that possibility not just as worrying as the possibility of the tyrant?
Well, so there's a number of different things that can happen when you have, just a horizontal society. But I wanted to reemphasize that I think anarchism argues for a lot more beyond merely horizontal societies. And even the term horizontal, I kind of avoid for the most part, not because I don't think it goes far enough. There's a lot of people on the left, more generally, who don't call themselves anarchists, who use Marina Satirin's term horizontalism to talk about more like direct democracy, local assemblies, workplace participation, workplace democracy, that kind of thing. And I'm as an anarchist, my critique is not just of one specific form of rulership, but it's against all form of rulership, all forms of constraint. And so collective constraint or collective domination is, I think, one of those as well. And there's a long anarchist history from basically every school of anarchism critiquing that kind of, or those kinds of structures to varying degrees. So I think that, anarchism proceeds far deeper in terms of our analysis. But if the specific question is not just, how can there be forms of domination that emerge through more egalitarian, non-hierarchical modes, but how do we deal with the issue of fracture or conflict in non-hierarchical modes? Well, first off, I need to take the cheap pot shot and say it would be hard to do much worse than the government does, right? Right now, the two primary forms of conflict resolution that take place through the centralized state are majority rules democracy and war. And the track record of those things is just abysmal. I mean, we're talking about the greatest mass murder, slaughter, oppression the world has ever seen. And then when it comes to conflict resolution, well, I don't think anyone thinks that getting 51% and thus having one section or one ideology brutally repress the other ideology and have the whole systematic repression mechanisms of the state in order to enforce their rule is anything better. Now, a liberal might object to this and say, well, we have checks and balances. It is not possible for someone to, the moment their coalition reaches 51%, brutally repress the minorities because there's this distributed system in which, multi-poles of influence and checks, provide, limits upon, any sort of coercive, centralized, or runaway mob power. But the answer to this, of course, is that what anarchism advocates is precisely that, all the more so. We advocate checks and balances to such a degree that, liberals can't even imagine. The idea is that not only are there, three wings of government or three wings of power, judicial, executive, legislative, but every single person is in some sense a check upon the other wings of every other person. If anarchy were to, in some sweeping magical sense, immediately emerge in some more fully realized form worldwide, you wouldn't have 8 wings of government, you would have 8 billion. And even more than that, because people will, in federative, fractal, stigmatic means, massively overlay all sorts of different forms of association, all different forms of social coordination, collaboration, etc. And all of these different, affinities, all of these different social bodies or social institutions, or perhaps more fluid than the word institution implies, provide check against all of the others. So if 51% of the population or some large body of the population means to impose their will, means to have their fractious perspective cause harm to other people, well, having more checks and balances, less centralization, no state that they can seize control over in order to impose their perspective upon other people is all the better, provides all the more options for those on the ground, because they are not, there's no constant threat or constant looming threat of state control, all forms of discourse and debate and discussion and persuasion don't take place through the lens of the chokehold of state and electoral politics, but happen interpersonally or through more diffuse and more productive means. And if somebody is collaborating, if their if their everyday social interactions take place through a variety of different social forms, a variety of different groups, if they are not just in like one commune, but in a variety of overlapping businesses or socializing groups or subcultures or, friend networks, they have all of those things richly embedded inside of their lives, and they have a great multitude of possibilities there. If a fracture occurs, if some kind of tension occurs that might build into widespread conflict or real conflict, they can simply move away from that. They can simply take advantage of the vast network that they have to like information on the internet getting around a censor, simply go around it. And so the idea is to, with that distribution, reduce the necessity or the likelihood of grand clashes. Now, in some sense, yes, this means a massive fracturing of society. This means, the infinite fracturing of society. But most of the disagreements that we have are made worse by the fact that there is coercive power in play. If someone feels that they can seize control over a state in order to impose their perspective, well, as opposed to broadly winning people over through persuasion or through, diffuse sanction, boycotting, cultural changes, etc. If someone feels that they can utilize coercion to solve their problems, they almost immediately turn directly towards coercion. So when there's a conflict in a society where there are broad centralized structures or monolithic structures that can be seized control over, and that can promptly win a great degree of control over their fellow people, that is all the more pernicious of a situation. So conflict currently exists. We mediate it as poorly as is possibly imaginable. The idea that people, walking down the street will get into an argument or get into cultural disagreements such that, knives will be drawn is simply ahistorical. It doesn't work that way. And you look at the cosmopolitan trader societies or societies where, you had large numbers of people collaborating in decentralized, organic ways, and with a multitude of connections. They weren't just operating within small localized tribes. And conflict was rapidly diffused in all of those situations. So the entire point of anarchy is to avoid the cataclysms that happen from disagreements when the only way to disagree is via war or in similar, almost the same definition, through politics in the electoral sense. Sorry, and if the question is more broadly, people talk of anarchy as the breakdown of society in the sense of person against person, somebody robbing you on the street or whatever. Well, of course, since anarchism is opposed to the constraint of, as a philosophy, as opposed to the constraint of people by other people, the petty tyrant of the robber baron or the mugger in the park, all of those things are, we oppose philosophically. So the question is will those things emerge in an anarchist society? And that's not an issue of disagreement. That's simply an issue of opportunistic, coercive, bottom-up power. Well, anarchists have proposed a variety of ways in order to, through broad-based checks and balances in the society, suppress the emergence of such pernicious behavior. And there's huge tomes written in the right libertarian, more ANCAP or market anarchist tradition that talk about or pull from the history of polycentric legal systems, adjudication networks, and those kinds of things. But as well, the social anarchist tradition has a rich, although less academic and more pragmatic and shared in zines and small publications, discourse that has a great degree of analysis of forms of justice and social, norms and how you enforce those things, or how you can gravitate towards the least pernicious versions of those things in a distributed way. And one of the nice things about those kinds of distributed systems, whether they lean more in the form of more formal polycentric legal adjudication systems, or if they lean in the more social anarchist direction, is that they have there is field testing on all of these things, and nothing is perfect, but there is not the history of catastrophe that the status means. It's just, they're soaked in blood. So,
Ryan, did you want to say anything else about that?
Sure. I continuously feel like I'm the warm-up act for the main comedian. Gillis just puts everything just so eloquently and really gets the heart of the matter quickly. And I also feel very similarly to just the same kind of position. Well, the issue is, it's twofold. It's like, okay, so anarchism to a sense is going to be, it's going to seem like radical decentralization, right? Because we're just like constantly, we want the multiplicity of options as maximization of options as much as possible. But it's not just that, right? It's not just decentralization, because of course then you can also have federations and that type of stuff, and things can work its way up. But even beyond that, it's the creating of positive social arrangements, right? So not just, well, we just kind of have this neutral, everything just gets tried all at once. I mean, that's going to happen, but the anarchist perspective also wants to test specifically anti-authoritarian arrangements, right? So it's a positive and a negative at the same time, I guess you could say. So you have, when it comes to the question of, well, the co-op could go wrong, I don't think there's anything human that couldn't go wrong. We often say the whole, well, if I think even Gillis wrote about this recently, if humans aren't angels, then we shouldn't want just a few of them to be able to decide for everybody else. We should want to break that down to the greatest degree possible. So even though a co-op type situation or whatever horizontal situation you could imagine could still go wrong because it's going to include humans, then the question goes back to what Gilles was saying. Well, what do you want? Do you want to move in the direction of more centralized arrangements where it's probably more likely to occur? Or do we want to move away from this view of having a final say, one person or one kind of mechanism that has the final say, shuts it down and move on, doesn't really matter what anyone thinks, just fall in line because this is what was decided. Or let's move in the direction of, well, there's competing opinions, there's different needs from different sectors of maybe one organization, and that all has to be taken into account. And within the anarchist view, especially if you look at like Graeber, Graeber often looks at common people and dealing with common difficulties in life. Same thing with like Elinor Ostrom's project. I don't know, I won't go too much into Ostrom, but it's looking at people on the ground and the difficulties that they're faced with, and just the innovative arrangements that they come up with on the spot, right? It's not even formalized. It's not something like we plan ahead. Okay, if X problem arises, then thank God we came up with plan B to deal with it rather than plan A or what have you. It's much more spontaneous. And so to a certain degree, you can't really say, anarchism comes into the threshold and, we're just going to have all these co-ops and it's going to be fine because they have this specific plan for dealing with every single issue they've thought of. They probably aren't going to think of every issue because things change all the time. New technologies come into place, which cause new issues, even though they create benefits as well. And you just kind of have to work it out. And as Gil said earlier, you test it through practice. And if something doesn't work, if you're in a more fluid network of individuals relating to one another, you can much more easily error correct and switch to something else. But when you have these more formalized, rigid structures, especially, well, that tends to go hand in hand with centralized structures, but you could imagine a more horizontal collective commune being like that too. It tends to go more difficult because you've just got these few loud voices that decide everything, and that's kind of the end of the story. So I would say, yeah, okay, things are probably going to go wrong, but on what level is it going wrong? And what's the flexibility in being able to correct whatever the wrong is? So the anarchist perspective would be much more in line of, let's allow things to be, broken up as much as possible, right? There's a lot of flexibility, there's a lot of options, and at the same time, opposing this idea of the one person has the final say perspective. Things are more fluid.
So I'm fairly happy with those answers, and I think I'm basically on the same page with you on that. So I want to make a conjecture here, and actually some of the objections I've raised earlier, I've been sort of I'm raising them because I could see that they could come up, although I don't necessarily take them all that seriously myself. Here's one. This isn't an objection; it's more just a conjecture, but it's something that I am kind of inclined to believe myself, and it's something like this. If we were to remove any particular structures of power from society, so let's say the government, or pick your favorite, whatever. The fact is that whatever resultant group of free people would come out of that would still have the power, the ability to recreate those kinds of structures. In any number of ways. And so basically what that implies is that fundamentally any successful anarchism has to be primarily a massive cultural shift. In other words, it has to be the sort of shift that happens such that the people that come out of that cultural shift would not feel comfortable with something like that arising. They wouldn't want that kind of thing to arise. And so I kind of want to say, any one of our favorite targets, the government, whatever, whichever one you like, we can target them, but we should see that as maybe just strategic or kind of intermediate, but that, anarchism itself has to be fundamentally cultural, since our end goal puts the power in the people. And so if those people don't have a kind of freedom-loving power, then the thing can do nothing but recreate itself.
So I think that there's a couple components. One here, when you talk about like how many people need to be converted to a broad perspective, a way of looking at things, I think different institutional macro structures will perpetuate different degrees of harm in ways not directly depending upon, or you need different thresholds of people who care about freedom and who have like broader anarchist values and ideals in order to achieve less harm with different macro structures available. So if you have, or different broad institutional forms inside the society. So culture is such a wide and sweeping array of things that, it feels almost unfair to have just one word for all the things that we're talking about and to sweep it all under that rug. But it's certainly the case that if we change like people's broad, personal inclinations, their tendencies, their values, their perspectives, their habits, those kinds of things, and we fail to change institutional structures, then the institutional structures will persist because it only takes so many people within a state to hold on to state power. If the state power isn't directly tackled, then it's still a problem. But in the other direction, I think that you can have a far freer society, a far more anarchistic society with fewer people broadly aligned to anarchist values than would be necessary to completely overthrow or take down a state if the base of the actual population of that state of society was broadly anarchistic. So the tipping point for people to take out a state through the democratic electoral whatever sort of means without mass insurrection or broad engagement or some level of direct engagement with the state itself, the point where the state itself would wither away just from cultural changes alone is much, much, much higher then I think the fraction of the population that would need to be anarchist in order to stop the reemergence of states in an anarchist society where the macrostructure is anarchist. Does that make sense?
Yeah. So something like if we so the amount of cultural shift you need to get rid of a state when we already have it is much higher than what you would need in order to stop it from recreating itself if you
Right,
already
right.
started from that. Okay,
Right.
that part of what you said, I can be on board with.
So that says that we can win the culture war, the anarchist culture war, to some degree, but overthrowing the state or taking out the state and other institutions or changing those institutional structures, those macrostructures, whatever. If we simultaneously attack them, our win condition or the array of things necessary in order to have a freer society or a much freer society would be more quickly accessible. And further, I think that when we talk about this in terms of resiliency, statist power structures are highly resilient against cultural changes. Against, Gustav Landauer was a German anarchist, social anarchist from way back when, and he has this line in broadly reflective of his policy, which is the state is a series of social relations. We replicate the state by the ways that we relate to one another. I don't think anyone would disagree with that, but the state is a very particular series of social relations that in some way doesn't care if 90% of the population is like, yeah, the state is terrible and we shouldn't have one. There are still broader structures in terms of enforcement, in terms of the game theoretic realities of centralized coercive power that mean that even if 90% of the population votes for there to be no state, the politicians can still be like, we have nuclear weapons and we're going to nuke any city that tries to not obey our laws or something along those lines. Like, that's an absurd example, but it's to illustrate the level of coercive capacity or resilient capacity that centralized coercion provides. In an anarchist society, the reemergence of centralized powers would be checked by the rabble, essentially, the vast panoply of social forms of institutions, of networks, social clusterings or organisms that we don't yet have structure or intuitions about. That would hopefully emerge in a robust anarchist society over time. But as a consequence, it's much easier to, when you're in an anarchist decentralized state, hold off the emergence of centralized cancers, because the moment that one starts to emerge, you know what that looks like. And everyone else that has broadly anarchist values in society can turn to focus upon that small little perturbation of proto-state and smash it in its cradle, as opposed to taking out the entirety of the U.S. empire, or the massive superpowers and the modern nation-state systems that are so almost impossible to overthrow. Now, there's broader exceptions and strategic complications and things that we can get into. Like, if an anarchist society is highly decentralized in the sense of being local, small tribal clusters, then it becomes a lot easier for the reemergence of state power, because those tribal clusters are in some sense disconnected from one another. There's not massive overlapping. Someone has a sense of exit, but they only have so many opportunities. And that exit is like a dramatic change of their life, where they change the entirety of their society because they move from one tribe to another, as opposed to having massively, all these different organizations or groups or friends or networks that I'm a part of as a single individual. So in the situation, so there are decentralization alone is not a magical salve that perfectly removes the possibility of a state reemerging. But you have to have connectivity, you have to have a variety of other things, you have to have broad cultural things. But my point is that, we don't have to completely, absolutely persuade every last person on the planet in order to, stop statism. We don't have to persuade everyone to have anarchist values or anarchist morals or whatever in order to stop the titanic monstrosities of current statism as we know it from reemerging from an anarchist society. Now, that still leaves open the very rich issue of complex particulars of strategy of how do we overthrow the existing bodies that currently rule us. But my pushback here would be to say that, like, yes, absolutely, we have to win the cultural battle. We have to persuade people. We have to build a change in society on so many levels and so many dimensions, philosophically, culturally, and so many. I mean, culture. I'm straining at language because in the Western discourse, it encapsulates almost everything that makes up a society. But we have to change all those things. But at the same time, we have to deal with the monsters that are currently bombing people, the monsters that are currently like enslaving us. Like that is absolutely something that needs to be tackled. And I don't think that you get an easy. I don't think the quickest path to that is through just persuading people. I think that there's a lot of things where struggle is necessary and resistance is necessary. And further, I think it is easier to win some cultural battles inside of some institutional frameworks than it is to win them in other ones. If you are under the boot of a fascist government, it is going to be a lot harder to persuade people of like the rights of trans women or something along those lines, or a cultural change, than it will be to do so within the liberal capitalist republic or something along those lines, right? Like, so if you are under the boot of a fascist government and there are a bunch of liberals who want to revolt against that fascist government and impose their own oppressive, liberal republic, it may make sense for anarchists in some sense to see them as a lesser evil and to collaborate in that struggle. There are a variety, and that's one hypothetical. I in no way mean to use that as the exemplar to go to in all the other issues of the complexities of strategy and of social change. It's merely my point that there are the institutional impacts, the availability of the cultural changes, and when broad socioeconomic changes happen in a society, that can open up space for institutional changes, that can open up space for cultural changes that affect institutional changes. There's a lot of interconnections in complex ways. If people are starving because of socioeconomic destitution that has been imposed upon them in a variety of different ways, or whatever the case is, there are large amounts of people who are desperate, who are economically destitute. Those people are not going to have the time or the space to coordinate against institutional repression of the form of like the state cop on the street in any significant way, because they're hustling so desperately to get a job or to like get food on the table every day. And also they're not going to be necessarily, as long as they're in those oppressive wage relations, or they're in those oppressive sort of dynamics where they have no other options, they're not going to be open to a lot of social change and cultural particulars. They're not going to be having philosophy reading groups. And I say this as somebody who came from a history of poverty and was homeless as a child. I'm not suggesting that the poor or the depressed people don't have the capacity to read books and be philosophers, but I think there is significantly limitations that are placed upon people given these broader social conditions, and when you win space for struggle, when people struggle together, when they resist together and win ground against institutional or socioeconomic or broader contextual limitations of their freedom, I think that can in many ways facilitate very strongly the emergence of, or the space for the emergence of new cultural, more broadly anarchistic perspectives.
So actually, I agree with a lot of what you said. I disagree with some of it. I kind of want to say where I think I disagree, and then Ryan, I want to ask you to kind of like comment on either what I said or Gillis, and see sort of where you stand on the disagreement. So I agree that when you were talking about, for example, the fact that certain factors like are you in extreme poverty, and so you won't necessarily have the time or resources to be able to focus on certain things. Like I really agree with that. There's two things in what you said that I disagree with, that I think make me come out a little bit differently in terms of my overall picture of strategy. One of which I think I'm a bit more confident in than the other. So one is this. I'm not convinced that if a majority of people in a society were to withdraw their consent and essentially their compliance, that the state, simply by having the weapons and having already a sort of structure of power, would be able to actually maintain that. So I tend to be somebody that thinks of, you know, widespread compliance as actually being a more important factor in the holding of power than the actual people in power doing whatever it is that they're doing. So, I'm interested to hear a sort of response to that general attitude. And the other, and it's related, is that I tend to think of a society as, or let's say a political structure, being just a part of a society, as broadly reflecting certain sociocultural components of that society. So that is to say, even though, yeah, of course, the people in power, right, even if the culture changed, they're not going to want to give up their power. But I still think that, though gradually, quite rapidly, if the culture did shift in that way, they would lose that power. And again, this is related to the first comment, because the way in which they would lose that power is that they would lose the necessary compliance and consent required for the state to be maintained. So yeah, Ryan, in that sort of area of disagreement,
Yeah.
what do you see?
Yeah. So first, I'm not sure if Gillis was saying that a certain percentage of the population would, let's say 75% of the population said, you know what, we're done with you, state, we're done. And I don't think Gillis was saying it necessarily wouldn't lead to the dissolution of the state. I think what Gillis was saying was something of the sorts of like, even if that still didn't, lead to the close, the final crumbling of the state, because they could still threaten with all their other stuff. You could still have a broadly anarchistic society because the people could still relate broadly one another. I'm not so sure that's exactly what they were saying, but
so
I think.
So let me clarify. I was trying to suggest that there are equilibria points that, in terms of institutional structures or social structures, that culture can deviate quite a bit from, but still not change without pushing back upon those institutional structures. And I think that one doesn't have to look very far to see examples where the state were seen as, today there's this plethora of literature in the philosophical canon or political philosophical canon about like the legitimacy of state power. But I think that that's extraordinarily a modern perspective. I don't think that it like relates very well back much beyond the last 2 centuries. People didn't really think of states as being legitimate in like a truly deep moral or ethical way. Certainly there were instances of, theology and like state cults and like people broadly like worshiping their leaders and all kinds of different things in which they built broad support from the masses. But I think a lot of times, and not just think, there are a lot of historical examples where the populace did not like their rulers, and they did not want to be ruled by their rulers. And they would do small things as much as they could get away with to resist or to withdraw their consent. And so, the consent was never even remotely on the table, but to withdraw their like collaboration in those structures. And often this did not mean much of anything, because unless you are willing to have unless you have like a huge percentage of the population willing to die, in their resistance. If people are just like, I just refuse to accept when the tax collector comes and I refuse to like turn over things. Well, you get killed, right? For the most part, the arm of the state is real. And if masses of people, if large bodies of people revolt, well, then the army is called in, then the police forces are called in. And many of these things, the point of those standing bodies, of those bodies, was specifically to put down mass resistance. and mass revolts and those kinds of things. I mean, you look at the history of a lot of these institutions that we today see as things that evolved into the police, the modern military. The point of them was to be able to put down mass resistance, mass withdrawals of consent. So it's certainly the case that, like, if you have 90% of the population, or you're going to say 60 or 70% of the population that are like ideologically anarchist and are, like so committed to anarchist morals and anarchist values that they're willing to like sacrifice almost everything, then yeah, okay, instantaneously there's no more state. I absolutely agree. But what is more likely the case is that you have a number of people who have those values to some extent and are willing to move inside of some directions and make some sacrifices in their lives in order to resist, if they're an anarchist society, the emergence of like state power, or if they're in a statist society, the continued perpetuation of that state power. But I do not think that that necessarily means that you need the consent of those ruled in order to rule. A lot of societies function particularly well without that. And this also, there's this notion of like, and I think this gets down to a very pacifistic sort of notion of what withdrawal of consent would look like. I have a lot of love and support for people who have done tax resistance, or people who have done draft dodging and those kinds of like very specific forms of resistance. And my father was, for vast majority of his life, deeply enmeshed in sort of pacifist activist organizing. But somebody who says, okay, I'm not going to turn over my grain to the tax collector is going to get shot. And if you get large numbers of people who are willing to say, like, okay, I'm not going to turn over my grain to the tax collector, those people are mostly going to get shot. And even in those instances where large numbers of people say, okay, we're not going to turn, the gears for the factory, we're going to go on strike, the Pinkertons were called in and those people were killed en masse. I mean, the history of all of these struggles of withdrawal have been, if we need your labor, we will forcibly enslave you, or slaughter you until your will breaks. And if we don't need your labor, we will just slaughter you until you're gone. And so I think that you need a lot more than just the willing. I think most people, it is quite reasonable to understand that most people with lives, with families, with everything, are not willing to sacrifice to that degree, even though they may in no way consent to being ruled by their current system. And I think if you were to ask most Americans, I think most Americans would agree that they don't think the government has legitimacy. I don't think that most people think that like a lot of the forms of state power that are exercised over them are legitimate. I think that they do not feel that they're legitimate in a really deep and visceral, intuitive level. I don't think that matters very much, because I don't think that they have the commitment necessary to resist in ways that would mean something. So if we are talking about changes of culture to such a degree, or to sweeping degree, that people do mass withdrawal, I think you need an immense amount of commitment to anarchist ideals and values in order to be willing to sacrifice the amount of bloodshed that would happen if people did those mass withdrawals. If those mass withdrawals were in any way meaningful, if a bunch of people who are surplus labor, who the state doesn't care about, want to go to fucking Antarctica and starve to death there, the state does not give a shit. But if they're going to withdraw in ways that actually like challenge the state's power in a significant way, or its hold upon other people, the state will respond and will suppress you. And so the question becomes like, what is the most effective way to remove state power in those situations? Maybe this is fencing you into a read of your perspective that isn't necessarily fair, but I think that the notion of pure withdrawal, of just like the Etienne Laboutier's kind of like, we just fail to give legitimacy to the state. We all recognize the state is illegitimate, and we fail to recognize, we just, laugh at the policeman who comes to our door to threaten us, or we respond to them as we would any other, brute thug. I think that that's unrealistic, and I think that it's asking a lot of human suffering out of people that would possibly not add up to something that would be significant enough for change. In contrast, if 10% of the U.S. population or 10% of the world's population was like committed anarchists, but wasn't just a matter of withdrawing their labor, it was striking against those systems that oppress us, and capable of like, directly dismantling, directly getting in the face of the physical infrastructure, of the individuals, of the specific means and structures that hold us down, I think that we could demolish the state. So that's a differentiation that I wanted to make, because I think it's really important. And while I have a lot of love and respect for the people who purely want to withdraw, I don't think it's feasible, and I think it's asking for an immense amount of human bloodshed, looking at like basically any situation like that in history. And almost all of those people have almost all those instances of mass like refusals turned into insurrections or broad-based militia revolts or those kinds of things because they were forced into that position. So I would like people, I'm not urging, violence in the present context. I'm not saying it's always strategic. I'm not saying any of those things. I'm just saying that, like, I think it is problematic and ahistorical to expect a mere a change in perceptions of legitimacy to equal the dissolution of the state.
I even think Gelderloos, if that's how you pronounce that last name, wrote a book directly discussing that issue. I'm not sure if anyone knows. I could have sworn I heard that.
Yes.
Was the case. But
Sorry
so
to interrupt. Do either of you know the name of the book?
How Nonviolence Protects the State, and he has a more recent one. Do you know the name of that, Ryan?
Gosh, I even forgot that one. I haven't read either, but I don't know it off the top of my head. I'd have to look and dig.
It's okay. Maybe you can send it to me later, and I'll put it like in the notes of the. But yeah, anyway, continue.
Sure. So there's two parts to it, because then there's one part of, all right, what would shut down a state? Because that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going in an anarchist direction, right? Because states have fallen and others have propped up. So one example would be in 1989, there was the revolution in Romania. It was probably the bloodiest revolution of the whole fall of the Eastern Bloc. And in that case, there was a pretty sizable amount of the population that went to the streets and were, not willing to put up with the Ceausescu regime any further. And to a certain degree, the military was complicit with what Ceausescu wanted to be done. But then once a certain percentage of the population came to the streets, they actually started to side with the people. But Ceausescu also had a secret police type of arrangement. And so they end up fighting the military at the same time. It was a very strange set of circumstances, actually. A quick funny side note was that their general was sitting next to one person who had seceded from the secret police, and they were right next to each other. And the whole time, the secret police guy, although he tried to lead them to believe that he had joined them and was not going to be a part of the secret police anymore, was on the phone right next to the general, giving away all of their placements. So it's kind of funny. But in any case, that was an example of, in fact, the population going really large out on the street and protesting, in fact, in many cases violently. There was a lot of different factions fighting it out in the streets. And at the same time, the military, seeing where it was going, sided with the people, and they ended up becoming sort of the decision makers on what went next. And the people weren't an anarchist population, right, by any stretch of the imagination. So it wasn't like they were calling for, well, let's smash the state and then create different forms of relations to replace it. It was kind of like, well, we're fighting out in the streets because we want Ceausescu gone. And then, the military just kind of took on the role of what should come next. And, of course, it was just another state. So that's the one part, right? How do you get rid of the state? And I would probably agree with Gillis that you're probably going to need quite a bit of massive resistance, if not quite violent resistance. But then secondly, you would also have to be dedicated. And this is where the culture part, I know that's kind of a messy term, but that's where that part comes into place of, is the population, now that they're revolting, are they at least largely dedicated to anarchist values? Do they want to produce anarchist relations to replace the state? And that's maybe even the more difficult situation because, obviously we've had many cases of states falling due to revolutions and stuff like that. And then just something else, maybe even worse, comes into place afterwards. Now, how do you do that? Well, so one example of just why that culture piece is important, we can think of one very recently. So in the year 2000, it would have been totally unheard of that same-sex marriage could be passed in the United States. Largely public opinion polls, it was overwhelmingly against, well over 68%, at least from some of the polls I looked at. So there was no likelihood that was going to come about. Now, you fast forward to 2011, that's where you saw like the intersection between the for and the against. And it started moving more and more in the direction of most of the population was starting to be, at least on the gay side of things. We're still working with, trans and non-binary people, which is very important. But at least on the issue of, gay people, it started moving at least in the positive direction. There's a lot of work ahead, but in a very short period of time, a lot changed because just the culture changed. And that's a messy discussion. There's a lot of reasons why. But there is a level, there is a threshold that you need to reach that kind of a change can come about. Now, in terms of, bringing about an anarchist society, how you would go about that, I'm not maybe the best expert on that, but there's, multiple ways you can think of it. You could have the idea of there's this massive just revolt like we were talking about earlier, maybe kind of like revolting against the Ceausescu regime, where it all crashes. But thankfully, the population's already on board with the, anarchist values, so no problem. We've already probably been doing the work of building the relations. But of course, there might be the other case of a more Proudhonian look of things, like the state exists as it is now, and maybe we've gotten really smart with different ways we can coordinate and produce those relations that we want now. It might be kind of a double dipping situation where you're still in, like in your case, maybe you're still in your managerial circumstance where you got the 3 levels of management, but at the same time on the side, you've also been working in, some kind of a anarchist arrangement that's, going to take on mutual aid mechanisms and that kind of thing. And then as that gets built up, there's going to be a challenge to the state. There just is. Once it reaches a certain threshold, there's going to be this decision. Are they going to start to crush us and we end up in the, I'll go back to the 1989 revolution circumstance. Are we going to end up there? Or is this going to be a slow process of, while we're building these relations up, they're sending CIA to undermine things? That seems pretty likely to me, because that's just what they like to do. It's hard to say. Like, that's a case of, in my opinion, let's be educating, kind of like what Gillis was saying earlier, and trying to experiment and build projects now. I'm not sure where Gillis stands on this issue, but at least I've been very excited about the prospects of seasteading, the Seasteading Institute. Not maybe necessarily what they're going to do when they start it, but once that gets taken off, right?
Sorry, can you just briefly say what that is for people who don't know?
Sorry, yeah. So there's this institute called the Seasteading Institute. It was started, I think, early 2000s, and not necessarily quite personally on board with some of the biggest financiers. Peter Thiel, or however you pronounce his name, was a big part of the project. But I think the ideas are important because the concept is essentially that you build these floating cities, right? So international waters where it's outside of the reach of nation states. And you can start experimenting with different forms of social arrangements, organization, maybe even different economies on these floating cities, whatever size they may be. That's going to differ. There's a lot of different engineers working on these projects right now. And, the idea is that eventually a lot of this will get started out. It will be expensive at first, and then it will multiply. More people will be able to easily replicate it, just like everything else, the way it works. Usually it's really expensive at first, and then it sort of multiplies, and it's easier to do. But I think that would be a nice project to see take off the ground, where, people could build these floating cities and start more easily, because you don't have like the different levels of government hanging over you, local, federal, state, all that type of stuff. Start trying these out and then demonstrating to the world that, hey, look, there is another way. Now, obviously, there's a spillover effect, right? Because you can't have millions of people swarming to floating cities, especially when it's starting off. But the idea would be you would probably disrupt a lot back on land, and people would want to be experimenting with those forms of relations there as well. I'm not saying that's the be all end all. I just think it's maybe a neat idea that could be explored to at least move us in that direction. But ultimately, it's projects like that and just general experimentation, on the ground testing for new ways of relating to one another, new technologies, different types of P2P arrangements. I'm a big fan of like Kevin Carson's desktop regulatory state book and his overall project that's multifaceted. Maybe a little bit of markets here, P2P arrangement here, co-op, just again, back to the A Thousand Flowers Bloom. Let's have everything on board. Let's not be like, what's the strategy? No, it's probably not the strategy. It's going to be a multifaceted, toolbox of strategies. So that's kind of where I generally come from on that. Now, I do want to say one thing, because what you said earlier was like the concern of something worse, maybe worse or the same, coming back into existence after the state falls or something like that. So there's an example that gets shown all the time. A lot of people know Steven Pinker, his famous book, which some characterize as anti-anarchist, or I haven't read the whole thing myself. I read a lot of it, but it's called The Better Angels of Our Nature, and he kind of tries to explain this idea of violence falling, and there's a lot of debate over it. I even talked with Noam Chomsky through email couple years ago, and he was like, "Oh, I don't think the case is that strong." But shelving that for a minute, Steven Pinker likes to tell this story of, he grew up liking anarchist texts. He read Bakunin. I don't know if anyone's ever asked him what of Bakunin he read, but he says he read Bakunin and liked him. And then at some point, I think it was maybe the 1970s, in a place in Canada, which is where he grew up, the police in a certain area went on strike. It was, I think, the only instance of it ever happening, and now it's like illegal for them to go on strike. But they went on strike, and he reports that things kind of went in disarray. And he was like, wow, I need to throw that silly anarchist stuff out. Well, putting aside what the details were on it, because I've heard some people say, yeah, there was an increase in crime during that period, but it wasn't as bad as he makes out to be. Shelving that for a moment, it's not too surprising that if people are dependent on certain institutions and ways of relating, and then you just kind of smash it, that suddenly, everyone's going to start acting just good and decent, and we're not going to have all these problems. That's not, at least to me, what any matured anarchist would propose. It's not just kind of a Rothbardian press the button and then voila, we're in perfect land of anarchy. That's really, at least for me, not the perspective. It's both positive and negative. Yeah, okay, we want the state to fall, but we also want to have relations in place so that when it does fall, we're not having people massively wanting to reinstate it or are okay with, in the case of Romania, the military just handles it. We'll just let the authorities take care of it. So, yeah, I mean, that's where I would probably go to is that, I don't want something worse coming about. I mean, from a consequentialist standpoint, which I know Gillis is definitely heavy in the consequentialist perspective of things, and I think you are too, based on the podcast I heard on left market anarchism you did. It would be like, well, okay, if we knew just push the button was going to lead to a worse situation, a much more unfree, unanarchistic, society, then maybe we shouldn't be so quick to be pushing the button. But the reason for not wanting to do that would be because there is a lot of work to be done. There are structures that we need to be building. That was Proudhon's perspective, because it was like, okay, we build these new structures, and then the state kind of gets smashed over time, in a sense, right? So I'd say that's my overall perspective. It's not as simple as push the button and then perfect anarchy. It all works out in the end. We know that's not necessarily the case, but it's a twofold process: opposition to the state and producing, anarchist structures, and then within the culture. I don't know how we want to put this: higher respect for anarchist values, or just in taking on anarchist values, wanting to take them on, something of that sort. And then drawing back onto the first thing I said about like the changes in the perspective on gay issues from like say 2000 to now. There has to be a process where that's worked through, and we're nowhere near that right now. So that's really all I have to say on that.
So I agree with most of that. There's a couple of things in this area that I want to nitpick, but I also want to be the responsible podcast host, and I promise we'd be done by 9:45 my time, and we're past that. And I'm sure that this could go on forever.
Yeah.
I think I'm gonna call it here unless there's like burning last words. Gillis, I
would give it to Gillis, honestly.
Do you have?
I don't really have anything else to contribute on that. I would quickly nuance that I think Pinker's argument is problematic in a lot of different ways. And I would also say that seasteading is not something that I'm super invested in, but I think that there are a lot of different avenues that people should be considering, and that part of a balanced strategy. It might be in there. And everything else, or basically everything else you said, I think is broadly on point. The strategic tangles that we face are complicated, and there's no clear prescription. But part of embracing anarchism is embracing complexity, and that should also apply to our strategy, and understanding that no one will ever be able to have a complete picture of the path forward. All we have individually are little tiny patches of what can be done and what should be done, and it's simply up to us to be vigilant and to engage as best we can with trying to make a better world. So
thank you to both of you for doing this. This podcast, since it's a sort of general philosophy podcast, goes to people just interested in philosophy who may have not heard really any arguments related to anarchism, or very few of them. So even though we didn't cover nearly a third of the topics within anarchism I might have hoped to, I think this was a good introduction. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
And yeah, you guys have a good night.
you too.
Take care.
Thank you.
And that concludes today's episode of Who Shapes the Barber. Again, I'm William Nava. You can check out other episodes, as well as my other philosophical and artistic work, at williamnava.com. And if you'd like to subscribe to this podcast, go to williamnava.podbean.com. Thank you so much for listening.